You've really outdone yourself this time, huh? Bringing Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel to our little deep dive.
And from the looks of it, you're not interested in just skimming the surface.
Well, you know how it is. To really understand an idea, you got to wrestle with it, grapple with the implications, and with Hegel, well, let's just say there's a lot to grapple with.
That's what we're here for. But before we get tangled up in Hegelian knots, how about we get our bearings straight? Who was this guy, and why should we care about what he had to say centuries later?
Right, let's set the stage. Picture Germany in 1770, the Enlightenment is in full swing, and ideas are flying everywhere. That's where Hegel enters the scene.
Born and raised in the thick of it.
Absolutely. Steeped in philosophy and theology from a young age. Imagine him debating with the intellectual heavyweights of his time, building on the works of giants like, well, who are we talking? Plato, Aristotle,
Particularly.
Immanuel Kant. Can't forget Kant. Hegel was fascinated by his work, but
Yeah.
he wasn't just content to be a follower, More like he saw it as a starting point, a foundation to build on and maybe knock down a wall or two.
Precisely, and that's exactly what he did. He became a leading voice in German idealism, a professor at Jena, Heidelberg, even the big leagues, the University of Berlin.
And not content with just lecturing, he put pen to paper and gave us, well, I wouldn't call them page-turners, but definitely works that still spark debate today.
Oh, absolutely. The phenomenology of spirit, the science of logic, the philosophy of right, these weren't exactly light reading back then, and they still aren't now.
All right, so we've got this German philosopher, professor, and author grappling with some of the biggest questions out there. But why should we dust off his works today? What makes Hegel matter in the 21st century?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer is his ideas, especially on things like dialectics, history, the very nature of reality, they've had a monumental impact on how we see the world. Like, he handed us a new pair of glasses and said, go on, take a look.
And his influence stretches beyond just dusty libraries and lecture halls, yeah.
Oh, for sure. His ideas on the state, for example, they ignited fiery debates and shaped political thought for generations to come. And then there's his work on consciousness and self-awareness. Those ripples are still being felt today in areas like existentialism, phenomenology.
It's like a philosophical family tree, and Hegel's the root system for a whole forest of thinkers.
That's a great way to put it. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dive into what exactly makes Hegelian philosophy so unique.
All right, so let's jump into the deep end with some of these core concepts. And one that pops up again and again with Hegel is dialectics. Sounds a little intimidating, maybe even a bit like a philosophical dance-off.
Less of a dance-off, maybe more like a philosophical sparring match. It's a process, this dialectic, where ideas clash, they contradict, but ultimately they push each other towards a more complete truth.
So not about one idea winning and the other one biting the dust, but a dynamic process that generates something new.
Exactly. Hegel, he was convinced that understanding emerges from conflict, from the friction of opposing views. So picture this. A thesis. Any starting idea, let's say, technology's the answer, it'll solve all our problems.
Not exactly an uncommon belief these days.
Right. But along comes the antithesis, the counter-argument. Hold on, technology creates its own problems. These ideas, they clash, they challenge each other's assumptions, and from that struggle, a synthesis emerges.
So it's like, what's that saying? Iron sharpens iron. The conflict itself refines the ideas.
You got it. And for Hegel, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical game. He saw the dialectic playing out everywhere in history, politics, even our own personal lives, right? As we grapple with contradictions, conflicting desires.
Our sources make note of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. And I'm getting a sense that we're about to delve into some pretty intense power dynamics here.
Oh, absolutely. It's a powerful illustration of how struggle and recognition shape consciousness for both individuals and entire societies. Picture it. A master, driven by this need for dominance, and a slave, forced into submission. On the surface, a clear power dynamic.
But this being Hegel, I have a feeling there's more to it, right?
Always. The master, totally dependent on the slave's recognition for their own sense of identity, becomes trapped by this need for control. The slave, meanwhile, through their labor, their struggle, develops a deeper understanding of themselves and the world.
So in a way, it's the oppressed who potentially achieve a kind of self-awareness that the oppressor never can.
That's the twist. And for Hegel, this process of struggle and recognition wasn't limited to individual relationships. He saw it as the driving force of historical progress itself, pushing humanity slowly but surely towards greater freedom and self-consciousness. Which brings us to another one of his big ideas, absolute idealism.
Okay, absolute idealism. Now, there's a term that definitely sounds, well, idealistic.
It is, but in a very specific philosophical sense. What Hegel argued was that reality, well, it's not just this external material thing. He said it's ultimately shaped by mind, by spirit, what he called Geist in German.
So instead of bumping into a table and saying, yep, that's real, Hegel might bump into an idea and have the same reaction.
Exactly. For Hegel, the world we experience, the very fabric of reality, it's all a manifestation of this Geist, of this grand unfolding consciousness. Like the universe itself is a thought process, constantly evolving, becoming more self-aware as it goes.
That's definitely a very different way of looking at things compared to just seeing the world as a collection of stuff. Where does history fit into all of this?
This is where things get really fascinating. Because for Hegel, history wasn't just this random series of events. No, he saw it as the unfolding of Geist in the real world. Each era, each civilization, represented a stage in this grand narrative of becoming.
So each historical period is like a chapter in the biography of Geist, with each chapter adding another layer of complexity, another level of self-awareness.
That's a great way to put it. Take ancient empires, for example. Hegel saw them as representing a stage where freedom, it was limited to a single ruler, an embodiment of the collective will.
And then things start to change.
They do. With the rise of democracies in ancient Greece, for example, Hegel saw a step towards greater freedom, even if it was still limited to certain groups. And this evolution, driven by that dialectic we talked about, continues through history, pushing us, always pushing us, towards greater self-awareness and a more perfect embodiment of reason.
So where do we end up on this Hegelian journey? Is there a final destination?
Now that's the million-dollar question. Hegel believed that the modern state, specifically the constitutional monarchy of his time, represented the highest stage of historical development, a system where individual rights and reason were recognized within a larger ethical framework.
So the modern state, you're saying, is the peak of freedom and reason. That's a pretty bold statement. History has a funny way of defying expectations, don't you think?
It sure does. And this idea of the end of history, as Hegel called it, it's one of the most debated parts of his whole philosophy. It's important to remember, though, he wasn't saying that, like, time would literally stop or that nothing new would ever happen again.
More like a culmination, right? Like a sense that this certain kind of progress had reached a point that couldn't really be topped.
Exactly. Hegel believed that with the modern state, humanity had achieved this level of self-awareness and freedom that just wouldn't be fundamentally surpassed. But, well, history, it seems, had other plans.
Yeah, the 20th century kind of throws a wrench into that whole end of history thing, doesn't it? With its world wars and revolutions and everything else.
You said it. And that's what makes Hegel so fascinating even now and so debated. Did he misread things? Was he limited by what was going on in his own time? Or are his ideas still relevant for understanding how things are still unfolding today, messy and unpredictable as they might be?
He might have actually raised more questions than he answered, but maybe that's the sign of a truly insightful thinker in the first place, huh?
Without a doubt. And speaking of insightful thinkers, we can't talk about Hegel without mentioning the impact he had on those who came after him. Like he was a spark that ignited an entire generation of new ideas.
We already touched on his influence in areas like existentialism and phenomenology, but there's one name that's practically inseparable from Hegel: Karl Marx.
Right. Marx, the father of communism, as they say, he was massively influenced by Hegel's dialectic, but he gave it a very distinctly materialist spin.
So instead of ideas driving history forward, it's the concrete stuff, the economics, the means of production, all that taking center stage.
Precisely. Marx was arguing that our economic systems, how we produce and consume, that shapes our ideas, our societies, even our consciousness itself. It was a huge departure from Hegel's idealism, but you could argue it wouldn't have happened without him.
So it's like Marx took a look at Hegel's grand view of history and said, love the enthusiasm, but I think we need to flip this script a little.
And that's a great way to put it. He took that engine of the dialectic, but fueled it with economics, class struggle, the tangible realities of human life.
So from those grand academic halls to the streets where revolutions were brewing, Hegel's ideas had a reach far beyond what he probably ever imagined.
Exactly. And that's the lasting power of his work. Whether they agreed with him or completely disagreed, Countless thinkers have wrestled with his legacy, and in doing so, shaped things as different as political theory, sociology, even how we understand literature.
Almost like we're all still tracing those ripples of his thought through time.
Right. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Hegel's world, it seems like we're left not just with a better understanding of his philosophy, but a sense of how those ideas, like ripples in a pond, can have consequences that just keep on going.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What Hegel would make of everything today. Would he still see us on that Hegelian path towards more freedom, more reason? Or would he see new challenges, new contradictions he couldn't have even dreamed of? Something to ponder, wouldn't you say?